Ana Paula, and today with me are Abigail and Mia arguing the affirmative, and Alexa, Aaliyah, and myself arguing the negative. We're going to be arguing about transgender kids being able to transition at such an early age, and transgender kids being given policies and facilities at schools. A transgender kid is basically like any transgender adult, but they're children and they're making tough decisions for their age. Being transgender is when you identify of the opposite gender. Let's say you're a girl, but you identify as a male.
Children should be allowed to have the option to transition in order to avoid negative mental and physical health outcomes. According to Valerie Struss, transgender youths have a higher chance of attempting suicide due to the fact that they are unhappy with how society treats them, which means that we should allow them to be free rather than hide how they feel and not allow them to be themselves.
Yes, children should feel comfortable with who they are, and they may feel like they might better identify with the opposite gender. However, transitioning is a life-changing decision, and children are nowhere near ready to make a decision like this. If they regret their decision once they're older, their own body can be a burden to them. Children and parents need to understand that transitioning isn't a phase. It is something that in some ways is irreversible. The worst thing is to suffer from gender dysphoria for the rest of your life once you realize that you regret transition.
Proven in many cases that children are so much more happy with themselves once they have transitioned, since they can finally express who they truly are and who they identify as.
Negative. Transgender children should not be allowed to transition at such an early age, as they can change their opinion later on in life if they would regret the decision they already made. Along with that, children are just unemotionally aware. Obviously, they know what's happening around them, but they're not as emotionally aware, and they're not going to use their logic as well as an adult. For example, a young woman named Lou who started hormone treatment and had a double mastectomy realized she didn't want to be a man, and now feels grotesque when she looks at herself in the mirror. They will then suffer from gender dysphoria for the rest of their life once you realize that you regret transitioning. Should we allow children to feel gender dysphoria if all our lives we're trying to protect kids from feelings like discomfort and annoyance with oneself? Why are we going to put this decision on them if it's so intense? If we allow these kids to mess up their lives, it's going to be a burden on us and it's going to be a burden on them. Do you want that to happen?
Even though that may be her case, and many other people's cases, they don't regret transitioning because they feel happier with themselves and they can now express themselves through the gender they want to identify as. Yes, changing your sex is a very serious topic, but if someone feels as if they were destined to be another gender, then they should be able to. Because everyone's different, and not all cases result in the fact that they do not want to be transgender anymore.
Children that transition their gender have to go through a lot of problems. Because in the article, Transgender Children and Youth Understands the Basics, they suffer from health risk, and also they trigger depression and other mental health problems. And also they result in homelessness or suicide and go through a lot at such an early age.
Affirmative. Children should be allowed to transition into the gender they identify with because it can harm their mental health due to the fact that keeping how they truly identify as can cause gender dysphoria. The author, Annie Marimo, cites the lie of living life as a girl made him physically ill, he said in court papers, and increasingly he kept to himself, sliding into deep despair. A therapist diagnosed Max's feelings as gender dysphoria, since not being able to be themselves or having the fear that they can't be the person they want to be has negative impact on them or anyone in general.
If parents truly act in the way that they believe will benefit their child, like changing their sex, they could actually be affecting them and elongating their struggle with dysphoria. According to Pacific Standard, there is only a small proportion of trans kids whose dysphoria actually persists. Dysphoria being distress or confusion regarding the sex you were born into. As presented, there is not a great percentage of kids who actually become of the opposite sex. Obviously, not obtaining what you want will affect your mental health, but a study conducted by a doctor named Dr. Suck was that suicidal rates of trans kids are the same as kids with ADHD or anxiety. Research has also proven that people who do transition are 19 times more likely to commit suicide.
Yes, they are very young and maybe not mature enough, but even their parents don't truly know what will make them happy, since they don't think or feel the same way as the children about certain things like gender. Even if there is not a great percentage of kids who actually remain confused, a decision should not be made based only on them.
Negative.
Transgender kids should not be allowed to transition at such a young age because there is a barrier difference between a child who likes to do things of the opposite sex or a child that actually identifies of the opposite sex. For example, an article named The Transgender Battle Line Childhood says that transitioning gender atypical males could consider being boys who simply liked female typical things. One doesn't necessarily need to be a girl to enjoy nail polish or bedtime stories about fairy princesses. If they have the choice to transition, they might do it by mistake, believing that they should, when in reality they just like certain feminine or male stuff. If we allow transgender children to be given the option to transition at such an early age, we may be putting a very tough decision onto them because they are not used to being of the opposite sex. They just like things of the opposite sex.
Yes, there is a big difference between a child who wants to transition and a child who enjoys the activities that are typically of the opposite sex. However, it can be extremely harmful for a child to not be able to identify with the sex they feel they truly are. Mental issues such as depression and anxiety can begin to arise at a very young age, which is something very difficult to go through at such a young age. Going through something like this can affect a child's future.
Yes, but you should consider the negative effects that transitioning could have on a child's mental health. We must consider the fact that other children don't wish to change their sex, but just want to dress like the opposite gender. This will then affect their mental health much more because they are being pressured into transitioning and are not content because they just want to dress like the opposite gender. They don't actually want to become of that opposite gender. Now we will be moving on to should schools have policies or facilities that help transgender children?
Affirmative. Transgender children should have the right to policies at school that would allow for their transition to come easier. There should be more gender neutral options present as to facilitate the way these kids are being treated by their peers, as it is already hard being a teenager. According to the Education Post, it says being a kid at school is hard enough. To not be able to deal with basic human needs is upsetting and dangerous. The more gender neutral options schools are able to provide, the better. This evidence helps us see how schools should implement options that make the school inclusive. This will allow transgender children to feel more at peace and will help them believe they aren't completely different.
If we begin these policies, other non-transgender students can feel discomfort. Allowing transgender students into the same bathroom as non-transgender kids can cause great discomfort because they are changing in front of someone that they view as the opposite biological sex. Obviously, as much as you say that you are all inclusive and you believe that that boy that changed into a girl is actually a girl, you're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable because you knew them as a boy. So you're going to feel unconsciously that you're changing in front of a man. In some papers presented in court, it has been shown that some schools are openly using bodily privacy, which is where no one is forced to undress in front of opposite biological sex. Why should these schools be benefiting all types of kids, but you want to create schools where you're only benefiting trans children and putting others' feelings behind?
The point of gender-neutral bathrooms and locker rooms is to allow transgender children to feel safe and welcomed in new environments. It is understandable the discomfort non-transgender children could feel, but this does not mean schools should not do nothing.
Negative. Schools should not have policies for transgender children, as in a few years they might change their mind and identify as their actual biological sex. Studies have shown that 63 to 94% of self-identified transgender children and teens often change their mind. The change of policy would just have been for nothing. This change of policies can also just be causing someone's high school year to just be completely uncomfortable just because we want to benefit these kids that eventually might change their mind. Because 63 to 94% is not a small number.
Even though your facts may be accurate, during that time period in which these people are in school, they may be feeling uncomfortable going into a restroom where there is only two genders, which in this case we need gender-neutral bathrooms to reassure the safety of that student.
Schools do create restrooms for transgender students. Other students might feel confused and might question why transgender children are getting private restrooms. Students can also feel saddened by the fact that transgender children are receiving more attention. It would make more sense if they just use the normal restrooms.
Affirmative.
Transgender children are often dehumanized, especially in schools, and this can lead to something much more than most people think. When schools create policies to support transgender students, it can go way beyond just making them feel accepted. It can also influence their academic performance and mental health. An article by Lee Green mentions, these exclusionary policies exacerbate the risk of anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, engaging in self-injurious behaviors, suicide, substance use, homelessness, and eating disorders, among other adverse outcomes.
If policies are made to support transgender students, it may lead to a huge spiral of confusion and discomfort to other children. The article Transgender Policies in Schools, a Waste of Time and Money claims that putting such policies into practice only encourages more children to question unnecessarily whether they are a boy or a girl. Furthermore, creating a space where you are always questioning who you really are, when in some cases it's not needed.
I agree that the rest of the students may feel uncomfortable sharing their space with a transgender student, but it is important to understand that without putting certain policies, there may be a chance of creating discrimination within the academic environment. This can be harmful for both the transgender children and the rest of the students.
Negative. Policies for transgender children should not be made because they only are harmful. The article, Here Are 5 Reasons Transgender Policies Are Harmful, explains how preventing sexual assault comprises another major area of concern. Public safety experts explain that predators abuse gender identity policies to gain access to victims. The concern is not that people who identify as transgender will victimize women, but that perverts will use such policies to do so. Indeed, after Target changed its policies, men disguised as women were caught doing just that.
But transgender children will not feel safe about the places they are in, and they need the safety because they feel the most vulnerable in the environment. So they need help to feel more safe because there are a lot of people who abuse of them and need help, so they can be free for the better of the society, which it says in the article Transgender Children Do Not Feel Safe, which explains it.
Yes, but what about the other children? They will be stuck in a world full of confusion because they will be taught to choose between what gender they should be.